Hi, my name is Sylvia Caney, and my nutritional intervention project discusses plant-based diet combating genetic susceptibility to cardiovascular disease. My research question is as follows. Does following a plant-based diet lower the risk of cardiovascular disease despite genetic predisposition? Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death globally at this time. Additionally, despite some genetic components, it is almost always avoidable through lifestyle factors such as nutrition and exercise. With all the talk about contagious disease this time of year, like COVID-19 and the flu, it is refreshing to talk about what you can do that you are in control of to improve your health and avoid preventable disease. A large reason for my interest in nutrition is its benefits in preventable disease, so this topic is of particular interest to me. This disease has affected many of my extended family members and friends, so for this project I decided to explore the benefits of plant-based diets in combating genetic susceptibility to cardiovascular disease. I know that throughout my upbringing I have repeatedly heard from family, teachers, and doctors that diet and exercise are essential for heart health, but for this project I decided to dive deeper into what exactly you can do for your diet to avoid genetic susceptibility to heart disease, in this case focusing on plant-based diets. So as you can see in these two graphs, heart disease is the leading cause of death globally, according to the CDC, and is also the top preventable killer. So I will now dive deeper in what specifically you can do in terms of diet to lower your genetic susceptibility to cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is an umbrella term for many complications in the heart due to atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis occurs when plaque builds up in the arteries, making them more narrow and causing blood pressure to increase. The increase in blood pressure becomes more difficult for blood to flow to the heart and other locations throughout the body. Blockage of blood flow can cause heart attacks and strokes, which can be lethal. Cardiovascular diseases include coronary heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, peripheral arterial disease, and more. Diet is very influential when it comes to modifiable risk factors for cardiovascular disease, specifically cholesterol. The symptoms of cardiovascular disease can vary, but common symptoms include chest pain, chest tightness, chest pressure, and chest discomfort, shortness of breath, weakness and coldness in the legs, and pain and numbness. When it comes to modifiable risk factors and nutritional intervention for cardiovascular disease, cholesterol is very important. Cholesterol is a large component in cardiovascular disease incidence and risk. There are two main types of cholesterol called high-density lipoprotein, or HDL, and low-density lipoprotein, or LDL. HDL is considered the good cholesterol, and it is caused lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Factors like moderate alcohol consumption, like a glass of red wine each day, exercise, and avoidance of smoking all raise HDL levels. LDL, on the other hand, is a bad cholesterol, and too much of it tends to clog and block arteries like the one shown on the right, compromising blood flow and raising blood pressure, like I mentioned before. Consumption of trans fat, saturated fat, and dietary cholesterol all raise LDL levels, whereas consumption of plant sterols, soluble fiber, and saponin, another component found in plants, all lower LDL levels. Unfortunately, we cannot control all of the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Genetics also play a role in the risk for cardiovascular disease. For example, statistics show that African Americans and Hispanic people have higher risk for high blood pressure, cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease than their white or European counterparts. Another part of genetics is family history. A family history of cardiovascular disease can indicate true genetic predisposition based on a variety of unchangeable factors like race or ethnicity. However, it can also indicate an environment created by a family that includes diet, for example, when we eat, how often we eat, exercise habits, and socioeconomic status. So your family has a large role in your eating habits. Culture can play a role in that and other things like that. So your family isn't all genetics, it's also the environment that your family creates in terms of nutrition and exercise and eating habits. Because the risk of cardiovascular disease is so largely dependent on food and diet, and because foods like red meat and eggs are high in cholesterol, it was thought that maybe a plant-based diet that avoids these foods would help to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. In order to explore this idea, a prospective cohort study was conducted by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. In these prospective cohort studies, researchers looked at the effects of plant-based diets on the risk of cardiovascular disease. Because not all plant-based foods are necessarily healthy, to help with distinguishing the types of diets better, the researchers assigned a healthful plant-based diet index, in which healthy plant foods receive positive scores and less healthy plant foods, such as potato chips or other junk foods like that are plant-based per se. However, that does not necessarily mean that they're healthy. And animal foods that aren't plant-based receive reverse scores. Also, the participants were screened for genetic risk factors and for stroke and myocardial infarction, and were calculated to assess genetic predisposition so that they could take that into account as they did the nutritional intervention. To calculate HPTI, they then assigned positive scores to healthy plant-based foods such as whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, oils, tea, coffee, and then they assigned negative scores to less healthy plant-based foods such as juices, sweetened beverages, refined grains, potatoes, fries, and sweets. It is important to note that just because something is plant-based does not mean it is necessarily healthy, and does not mean it's necessarily made of things like fruits and vegetables. The researchers followed up to 5 years after the study was conducted and came to the conclusion that healthful plant-based diet was associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease regardless of genetic predisposition. However, less healthful PDI was not as strongly associated with lower cardiovascular disease risk. The higher the healthful plant-based diet index, the lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. So the more healthier nutritional foods you're eating, the lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. So this is what this graph is showing. Q1 would be the lowest health-based index, but still plant-based diet, and Q5 was the highest plant-based index, so it got the best scores for nutritional value of the foods that were plant-based. And as you can see, the red line of Q5 has the lowest incidence rate of cardiovascular disease as time goes on. Based on these study results, we are able to make some recommendations. Although the risk of cardiovascular disease does have genetic components, very often it is avoidable with lifestyle choices. According to these studies, the healthful plant-based diet was associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease, regardless of genetic predisposition. However, less healthful PDI was not as strongly associated with lower cardiovascular disease risk. So just recommending a plant-based diet is not as helpful because there are many high cholesterol and processed foods that are plant-based. So, promoting a diet rich in a variety of healthful plant-based foods such as fruit, vegetables, whole grains, fiber, vegetable oils, and avoidance of red meats and processed foods would lower LDL cholesterol and therefore be a good recommendation for someone that is genetically predisposed to heart disease or just trying to prevent it in general. We need to understand the difference between a healthful plant-based food and an unhealthful plant-based food because there is a lot of cultural and social media push for plant-based diets, but strictly a plant-based diet does not necessarily mean that it's healthy and does not necessarily mean that it will lower cardiovascular disease risk. We have to make sure that we are eating healthful plant-based foods with high healthful plant-based diet index scores, like the ones in this study that showed positive results in reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. In conclusion, these studies show that despite genetic predisposition to cardiovascular disease, nutrition intervention of a healthful plant-based diet is effective in lowering the risk of cardiovascular disease. Thank you for listening to my presentation.